Well, there we go. Hey, we're live. How about that? Hey, welcome to the Energy Question with David Blackman. I am your host, David Blackman. With me today, very special guest who I met at a recent event for Ted Cruz, a roundtable that was hosted by Americans for Prosperity, the Texas chapter over in Dallas. Sanjay Narayan is a practicing attorney in Dallas, where his practice focuses on labor privacy, data privacy, labor and employment, complex litigation. He's a Texas native, grew up in Plano. He has a Bachelor of Arts in Political Science from Duke University, wonderful school. His Juris Doctor from Pennsylvania Law School, active with the GOP. He's a former intern for Senator John Cornyn and served on Chris Christie's finance and policy teams during the 2016 GOP primaries. Sanjay, how you doing today?
Pleasure to meet you, David. Thanks for having me. I'm doing well. Better to be on your podcast today too, as well. Appreciate it.
Yeah, I appreciate you taking the time. Your comments at that roundtable, I was just very impressed by your knowledge about so many different aspects of what's happening in the energy space. And, anytime I run into somebody who's obviously so much smarter than I am, I invite them to appear on this podcast. So I do a lot of episodes, obviously. Uh, but how long have you been out of law school? Just curious.
I graduated in 2012. Started my career in New York at a large international law firm. Convinced my wife to move to Dallas. She's originally from New Jersey, so that took a bit of convincing. But she's also an attorney. Yeah, she's also an attorney as well. Does private equity and fund formation. She's a partner at her firm. So we moved down here, and the rest is history. Have two young kids, and I'm really interested in overall policy regulation, but especially energy as it relates to everything and all of the above, because it's so pivotal to our standard of life, our quality of living. And as you can see, our friends in Southeast Texas are feeling the pain without power this week due to the storm. So it's really an important issue that it hits on everything. And I also think it hits on some of the hypocrisy of kind of the climate alarmist agenda. So it's a really important issue that's really at the base of everything.
Yeah, my wife Terry and I lived in Houston from 2004 through 16, and that was when I semi-retired out of the oil industry. And I look back on that and how lucky it was that we left Houston at that time. We loved every minute of Houston. It's a wonderful city. But since we left, they've been hit with Hurricane Harvey and all sorts of big storms, and we had a bunch of big storms this spring that flooded everything. And now this hurricane still has well over 1 million people, I believe, without power today. And, it's not due to a failure of the grid necessarily. It's power lines down by the hurricane and switching stations getting knocked out. But, man, we have a lot of problems with electricity here in Texas, don't we?
No, we do. And Houston's a tough one because you can't really bury the power lines either because of the risk of flooding. So it's kind of a tough situation to handle. And you're right. This is not something that necessarily could have been prevented. Maybe it could further withstand some of the power lines to make them stronger, more wind resistant. But the bigger issue is that overall as a state, we're struggling to produce enough energy as is. And when you add a natural disaster on top of that, it becomes even tougher. So, and producing more energy is a big problem across the country, especially here. You'd think that Texas would be an energy powerhouse, home of a quarter of the nation's oil and gas reserves, but we're not, and that's a big problem.
Yeah, and so much of it, and I'm pretty opinionated about all that, and I've watched it all develop because I was lobbying in Austin back in the 99 and 2001 sessions when the legislature thought it was a real smart thing to take Ken Lay and Enron's advice on how to structure our power grid, restructure it. And, and everything that is involved since. We've had 25 years of pretty irrational energy policy in this state and a bad grid structure that doesn't send the right economic incentives to generating companies to build the right kind of generation necessarily. And so all these years here for really 15 years, we've had a one-sided playing field where all the incentives were to build wind and solar. Right. And so that's what got built, even though we knew without any question at all after that 2011 winter storm knocked out a big part of the grid for several days, that we had this shortage of natural gas generation sitting here that still has not been resolved, but at least the legislature moved in this last session to incentivize that. So it kind of leveled the playing field. Do you see that having a positive impact going forward?
I hope it will have a positive impact, but I don't think they've gone far enough because the playing field has been so tilted in
Yeah.
one direction for decades that it's going to take a long time to recuperate the grid. You mentioned that we've overcompensated in wind and solar. I don't think. I mean, obviously, listeners to your show will know it, but I don't think much of the broader population, certainly in our state or even outside of it, understands that wind is actually the second largest producer of energy in our state. We're the
Yeah.
largest producer of wind energy in the country by a mile.
By far. Yeah.
It's not California, it's not Massachusetts, it's not New York, it's right here in Texas. And natural gas around 40%, wind is around 25% over the course of the year, but in some summer days it can be a lot more than that.
Right.
And that might sound like a great idea. It's great when it works, but it's really bad when it doesn't, right? Because you just mentioned the 2021 winter storm Uri, when 50% of our wind turbines froze at the lowest point.
Yeah.
And wind was operating at less than 3% of its installed capacity. And then what are you going to do? You're not going to be able to blow huff and puff on a wind turbine to create more energy. You can't magically have the sun shine when it's not. And so over reliance on these weather dependent, unreliable source of energy is a big problem. And I think that too few people have had the courage, the knowledge, and the boldness to state so expressly and just say
Right.
that, look, this is fine if you want to have this as an addition to our base load, but it cannot be what we're building. The required energy needs of our growing state cannot be reliant on these type of intermittent weather sources. We should be at the forefront of adopting and utilizing our God-given resources that we have here in the state. We should be using more natural gas. We should be using more coal and be unapologetic in saying
Yeah,
it.
absolutely.
And we absolutely need to build more nuclear power plants in our state. We need to be an innovator in doing that. We have all the human capital. We have all the material resources to do it. Why we are going off on this political tangent to build more wind and solar at the expense of reliable source of energy is really baffles the mind. And it's something that we've got to turn the ship around. And it's going to require more people like you and others to be, all of us collectively, to be bold and say, no, we have gone down the wrong direction. What is being called, quote unquote, renewable, they're not green. If you consider the amount of carbon emissions that go into all the birds and animals that are killed by the wind turbines and the solar panels, and where the cobalt and nickel and lithium, where they're mined, these are not green energy sources. What is green is nuclear and clean burning natural gas, and we should be relying on those.
Yeah, nuclear is so I look at it and when I think 20, 30 years out, we're going to have a lot more nuclear by then. In the short term, we have got to get more natural gas built just for events like Winter Storm Uri, so that you have this, what Lieutenant Governor Patrick calls an insurance policy of 10 to 20 gigawatts, and probably more than that you're going to need, of natural gas ready to dispatch when you're having a major weather event that we just haven't built. And everyone has known since at least 2011, like I said, that we have this problem, and it's only just now starting to get addressed, and really frustrating to me. Lieutenant Governor Patrick has taken a real leadership role on this, and I'm so proud of him for doing that, because no one else. It has been odd to me how reluctant the Republican officials in Austin have been to advocate for natural gas generation. And, I know a lot of it has to do with wanting to virtue signal about renewables, but it's created a big mess. And
I think a lot of people are reluctant to go against the prevailing dogma, which is kind of this ESG mindset that somehow you must hew to the totem of wind and solar and batteries at the expense of others. And again, I'm all pro growth. We're all pro technology. If something works, great, put it out there. You want to put a wind turbine and solar panels on your private land, go for it. No, I'm in favor of limited government, more access, less regulation. You want to do that, terrific. But when you're talking about providing power to close to 30 to 40 million people, we need to also consider the reliability factor. And we have gone along with the idea that somehow these weather-dependent source of power are going to suffice, and they're simply not going to. You can't build enough solar panels because when it's nighttime outside, they're not going to provide power. And so having the natural gas and really leaning into it and saying, no, we should defend forcefully and be bold about natural gas is clean burning. I mean, one of the reasons why the United States, amongst all nations on Earth, we've cut our carbon emissions by over 20% since the year 2000, nearly 800 million metric tons. There is no other nation, not even the entire European Union combined, for all their virtue signaling, they haven't cut their carbon emissions as much as we have. Why? Because hydraulic fracturing was invented here in Texas, and we adopted it.
George Mitchell,
Absolutely. And we applied it vociferously. And because of that, we were able to substitute clean burning natural gas for oil and coal. That's how we're going to make our environment cleaner, is by embracing technological revolution. It is not by artificial mandates set by some pinhead bureaucrat sitting in Brussels or in Washington, D.C., telling people what type of cars they have to buy, how much emissions they're supposed to have. It's by embracing growth. And that's what we need. We need more entrepreneurial innovation, and we need more people to defend that boldly, have courage to stand in the gap and say, no, this is the way to move forward, not only for our energy needs, but also for the broader environment, for our quality of life, is to embrace an all of the above pro-growth strategy. That means not taking anything off the table because of your political priors.
Well, you made a great point a minute ago that I want to actually expand on a little bit, get your views on it, because you said, we're going to probably need more coal, and I agree with that. And even the CEO of ERCOT, Mr. Vegas, a couple of weeks ago made an interesting comment in his testimony to a legislative committee, talking about the need, potential need this winter, and maybe even this summer during periods of peak demand, to be able to reactivate some of these mothballed coal plants that have been technically retired, but are still capable of bringing back online in an emergency. And a reader asked me the other day if I thought we would ever build another new coal-fired power plant in the United States. And I replied, yes, I do. And in fact, I think we're going to need to build more of them here in Texas, just because demand is exploding so much. And so much of that has to do with AI and data centers, Bitcoin mining. I wonder what your thoughts are there. Are we ever going to build any new coal plants?
If we do, they're going to have to overcome a lot of the kind of regulatory hurdles that have been built since 2008 that have basically criminalized the development of not just nuclear power plants, but certainly the development of more coal. I think a more existential threat to coal is the fact that natural gas tends to be cheaper. But if it's economically feasible to do it, absolutely. Coal is a very reliable source of power. You mentioned the 2021 winter storm. During that period when 50% of our turbines froze, which the media continues to lie about, when wind was operating at less than 3% of capacity, it was natural gas that increased by 450%. It was coal that increased by 97%. And wind declined by 93%. And it was nuclear power that remained at the most efficient source of power throughout that entire storm at over 80% of its installed capacity. So we need more coal and we need more natural gas, absolutely, because when you do have a power outage, or it's nighttime or there's no wind, you just need coal to shovel into the power plant. But you can't manipulate weather dependent sources like that. So if it's economically feasible to build coal, then by all means we should. And this is something that actually a lot of the northeastern states recognize, even though they try to tell other states what to do. New York, and people that wonder, why did 1 to 2 inches of snow bring Texas to our knees 3-4 years ago? Well, how is it possible that cold weather, which is like a day ending in Y for people in the upper Midwest and the Northeast, why do they not lose power? Well, the reason they don't lose power is because they use diesel. They use coal. Yeah. New Jersey gets 40% of its power from nuclear. There's a reason they don't lose power and we do. It's because despite how people might perceive our state and our interests and kind of the political movement that we have, our energy policy doesn't reflect those policy preferences. And so we need to bring them in line so that way we can actually provide for our people here.
Yeah. On Bitcoin mining, there was another fella at that roundtable who made some really interesting comments about it and its ability to be turned off and on, for these Bitcoin miners to shut down during periods of peak demand. I know that Lieutenant Governor Patrick has made some really negative remarks related to Bitcoin mining and questioned whether or not we should be allowing that industry to grow in Texas because it doesn't provide a lot of jobs and it does consume a lot of energy. I don't really know what to think about Bitcoin mining as it relates to the grid, and I wonder if you have any insights on that.
Yeah, so I forgot the individual's name. He was sitting right next to you, actually.
He was sitting, yeah.
So basically, the way Bitcoin mining, in the view of proponents, helps the grid is when prices are low, it provides a continuous source of demand. So that way, power generators have a profit incentive to continue providing and producing more power to the grid.
Yeah.
Otherwise, if the price went too low, they would stop producing for a period of time. So Bitcoin mining and crypto mining more broadly provides a continuous source of demand that can continue to allow for some profit for the power companies. On the other hand, when prices get too high or the demand is excessive relative to the supply in the grid, they can also turn off immediately, releasing that power back into the broader grid so consumers can get it. So there is some rationale to that. I saw Lieutenant Governor Patrick's comments as well, and I think he's been generally very good on the energy issue. I just think the concern on this one is misplaced. I don't think that we should be in the position of saying which energy uses are good and which ones are bad, because every productive society, you can draw a direct graph. The more prosperous of a society you become, the more energy you consume. So whether it's crypto mining, whether it's data centers, or something else that we haven't yet thought of, but I'm sure will come down the pike in the next 5 years, we need more energy. And rather than focusing, even in the short term, on the sources of demand, we should be talking about and really leaning into how do we increase the supply of energy to our grid so that there is not any activity that we are prohibiting or selecting or rationing and saying you can't innovate in this given field. Because we don't have enough energy for you. And so really, if we kind of change the mindset and focus on the supply side rather than the demand, we will allow the market to flush itself out. There are going to be people who are chasing profit in whatever industry it is, and Godspeed to all of them. But as a state, we've made the decision to subsidize particular forms of energy in the past. We can change that and decide to subsidize other forms of energy to make sure that we are an innovative state, that we're a leader in economic growth in whatever industry it is, data centers, crypto. Donald Trump has come out very much in favor of crypto. And I don't think that's going away anytime soon, whether you believe in it or not. Whether you want to buy Bitcoin or not is totally an individual decision. It's up to you. Obviously, CBDCs are something I'm totally against. We should all advocate against that. I would love to come back on your show and talk about that. But
but what you're talking about, and I agree with you completely, because then if the Republicans in Texas start to try to disadvantage crypto miners through policy, then you're picking winners and losers in the energy space, right? Yeah. Which is what we've criticized Democrats for doing for decades. And it doesn't make much sense to me to go down that road. I agree with you. We need to be focusing on expanding supply rather than tinkering with the demand side, because then the other side of it is then your state's going to get a reputation for not having adequate electricity on your grid, right? If you have to disadvantage certain industries.
Yeah, and we want to be a magnet for people to come here who have an entrepreneurial bent to them and who want to make life better for not just themselves but others, and incentivizing that by saying, or disincentivizing them, I should say, by saying that your particular industry is disfavored here. Who knows what's going to be advantageous and technologically plentiful in the future. We have no way of knowing that. And I would rather say, try it out. And we have enough power here in our state for you to manage that. Let's focus on that. And, building more coal-fired power plants, natural gas, they don't take that long to build. Right. We should be capable of doing it. You mentioned the PUC. and the ERCOT commissioner. I think right now, total demand, correct me if I'm wrong, something like peak demand is somewhere around like 90 to 100,000 megawatts.
Yeah, somewhere in there.
I think over the next 10 to 20 years, that's going to be closer to 150, 200. And so
That's what
we
Mr.
can,
Vegas said. Yeah.
yeah. And so, we can say over the next year, we shouldn't have this, we shouldn't have, it doesn't matter. Just by population growth, we're going to need to roughly increase the capacity of our grid by over 50%. So there's a lot that needs to be built.
And so to do that, right, you're going to have to build an awful lot of new generation. And the advocates for wind and solar are going to say, well, we can do that all with solar. We can do that all with wind. But there's never any discussion about all the land that has to be condemned to do all of that with solar and wind. I mean, for the land requirement for one nuclear plant, which might be, I don't know, a couple of square miles of land, you're going to use 20, 30 times that to generate that much electricity with solar or wind. And I just don't know that it's wise to be planning to use up that much land, because so much of the land that's getting used up around North Texas that I've seen is arable land. And we also need to think about keeping the food supply going, don't we?
You make an excellent point, which is, to get technical, wind and solar lack what's called energy density, which is the amount of energy that can be produced from a given unit of a resource. Nuclear power is the most energy dense resource known to mankind, but fossil fuels are very close second. I always say this, but to approximate the same amount of power from 1 square mile of a nuclear power plant, and of course a nuclear power plant does not have 1 square mile, they're generally smaller than that. You would need 75 square miles of wind and solar turbines, solar panels. That's 3 times the size of the island of Manhattan. And all the while, you can't use that land for any other purpose. You can't use it for agriculture. You can't even use it for recreation or for wildlife. And so it becomes unusable for any other purpose. And at the end of the 20 to 25 year useful life cycle of those panels or those turbines, they can't be recycled. They're going to end up in a landfill. And then you have to start the process over again. So the vast amount of land that is required for these weather-dependent, unreliable source of power, which I strongly advocate, that should be how we describe them, not as renewables. We should describe them accurately and truthfully. Just say the truth. They are weather-dependent, unreliable source of power, is so significantly larger than what it is for natural gas, fossil fuels, and especially for nuclear, that people need a space for housing, agriculture, recreation. We shouldn't mar so much of our landscape with these type of devices. When if somebody wants to put them up on their land, great, more power to you. But we shouldn't be betting our future on those as the producers of our main source of energy.
So one of the great features about doing these live streams is we can take questions from viewers in real time here, and Robert De Domenico is a very knowledgeable guy who comes in quite frequently with really good questions. I want to take a look at this one. Coal plants maintain a couple months of fuel on site, of course, which is one of their big selling points in a major weather event. Have mechanical inertia behind their generator, absent in all solar and much wind, because they employ inverters, which have no inertia. Absent these ingredients, grids are subject to production shortage and frequency. Actually, I think he meant frequent instability outages, the latter of which can be far worse than the former. Yes. Yeah. And so to that point, during Uri, and you talked about how wind fell off the grid during Uri, and at Rice University, the Baker Institute at Rice University did a wonderful simulation after Uri had passed. And they had it posted at their website for a long time that showed all sources of power generation in Texas and the order in which they dropped off the grid as Uri came. Uri was a series of 3 different major cold fronts that came into the state over a couple of days. And it showed, the weather sources dropping off the grid in order. And wind and solar were the first to drop off the grid. And then natural gas equipment started, transportation and some compressor stations began to freeze up, and a lot of gas fell off the grid as well. But it always got missed in the media that wind and solar were the first to fall off the grid during that major weather event. And it's because, as you say, they're unreliable and weather dependent, right?
In addition to that, the media, even to this day, still, if you can look at the Dallas Morning News, New York
Yeah.
Times, even the Wall Street Journal, if you go back and look at postmortems about what happened during that storm, they continue to repeat the statement that somehow the reason for the power outages was because natural gas and fossil fuels, quote unquote, lost more power than renewables. That
Right.
is a lie. That is a lie by omission. The
Yeah.
only reason that is true is because natural gas produces so much more power than wind and solar that even a small percentage decline of a very large number is still a large number. It's
Yeah.
like if somebody gave you without context and said that 10% of 100 or 50% of 10, which and just gave you the percentages, you would have to know of what in order to figure out, oh, wait, actually 10% of 100 is still much smaller, or excuse me, is greater than 50% of 10. And so that's what they did. It's a lie by omission because they're not giving the complete context. We lost power in our state because we rely close to 40% of our grid on weather dependent source of power. And we haven't mentioned solar yet. Solar, so Texas, the plurality source is natural gas around 40, wind around 25, coal around 20, nuclear around 10 to 12, and then solar right now is 5. But that's the fastest growing. It's actually projected to double by the end of this decade. 80% of the new power plants scheduled to come online to the Texas grid over the next decade are wind and solar.
Yeah.
We are still adding disproportionately high levels of weather dependent source of power to our grid, even today. And granted, we have, Elon Musk, phenomenal innovator, fantastic what he's done for free speech on the internet. Thankful for that.
Yeah. Thank God.
Yeah, exactly. So we can have this conversation truthfully about energy and the climate. He's building these battery facilities, in and around north of Austin. That's fantastic. Continue to build that, as long as you can find the lithium, cobalt, and nickel for those batteries, more power to you for building it. And maybe one day we will have sufficient battery technology to store all the energy to solve the inertia problem that your guest, asked about in the question. Maybe that will come one day, but that day is not today. And right now, all the battery technology in the country, if you combined it, would power the country for less than 10 seconds. And that's not sustainable. People need to drive. It's funny. So we went on a trip to Denver, Colorado Springs over the July 4th weekend, and we're at Avis to rent a car. And this is like a Seinfeld episode, actually, because the one where he asks, like, I reserved a car, where's my car? And they didn't have a car. We rented an SUV because of the 2 kids and we had luggage, and we're like, so you know how to take my reservation, but you don't know what to do with it, because they didn't have the car we asked for. All they had were electric vehicles. There were nearly 100 people in line. They said, we don't have any internal combustion engine cars for you, but we do have electric vehicles. Anyone can leave and come. You can get out of line right now. You can go and get an electric vehicle. And David, I'm honest to God, this was a perfect natural experiment for whether or not people want and are willing to use this technology, because instead of waiting in a line for an hour like I did to get the car, they could have left immediately. No one left.
No one.
Everyone stayed in line because nobody wanted to drive the electric vehicle. That's not saying they aren't good cars. Teslas are fantastic cars.
Oh, they're
even
beautiful
the Kia
cars.
Electric, they're fantastic.
Yeah.
But there are real issues about range anxiety, people wanting to go on trips, not wanting to stay at a charging station for half an hour, waiting for their car to fill up. These are real considerations that people, when actually push come to shove, actually make these decisions in real time. And I just thought it was a classic natural experiment. I mean, I was obviously angry at the time, but it was interesting to observe when people are given a choice rather than being told what to do, how they actually acted, even though there was a full-on incentive to pick the electric vehicle, and they just chose not to. And I don't blame them, because I didn't do it either.
Yeah, Avis tried to trick me at DFW here recently into an electric car. They just, I had reserved a specific vehicle, and when I got there, they said, "Well, we're out of that one. Here's your keys for this car. It's in space so and so." And I looked at it and I said, "Well, wait a minute, this is an electric car, isn't it?" And they said, "Yeah." And I said, "Well, I don't want an electric car." "But sir, here's the event." I said, "Look, I don't want an electric car.
Yeah.
I want a gas powered car. I reserved a gas powered car, and I insist you put me in a gas powered car." And so they did, but they, I mean, they were just trying to trick me into going and getting in an electric vehicle and driving it off the lot. And that was really, I find that tactic to be every bit as underhanded as the policies behind it, that are so dishonest and not really, the public's never really told the truth about all this stuff. So anyway, just an aside.
It's true, because we every day we kind of hear these Orwellian terms
Yeah.
they're euphemisms, right? Like renewable, or DEI, or privilege, or gender affirming care, or undocumented migrant, like all these terms which the normal American, when we just talk in vernacular, we wouldn't use these phrases, but they're designed to cabin the scope in which you have a discussion in order to, as Orwell wrote in 1984, is to curtail your avenues of knowledge. It's a form of newspeak, right? They want you to use these terms because then you're precluded from making an argument against them. And we have to constantly fight against that box and just tell the truth.
Yeah. The best one currently is, instead of referring to homeless people as homeless people, the people on the left now want to refer to them as our unhoused neighbors.
Yes.
Which is fine, but nobody knows what that means.
Right.
I mean, why try to obscure the problem you're talking about? It's just, but anyway, I shouldn't go there. Listen, man, we are bumping up against time already. This is unbelievable. I was going to bring up so many other things. Let's do this again soon. You're fantastic. I love talking to you.
I love it. I would happy to do it again. This is fantastic. Enjoy the viewers' questions as well, and always insightful to talk with you, Dave.
Yeah, let's get back together in a month or so. I'll set it up. I'll get in touch with you here in a couple of weeks, and we'll figure out a day and time.
Sounds great.
There's an awful lot more to talk about here.
Oh, much more.
Well, man. So I just want everyone to note that the address under Sanjay's name is his. It's your LinkedIn and Twitter address, correct?
And Instagram.
And Instagram. So you can follow Sanjay at all those social media sites. He's really smart guy on all this, as you can tell. And I really appreciate your time.
I appreciate you having me on. Always a pleasure.
All right. Have a great week.
Thank you. You too.
Bye, everybody.